It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Eric Perakslis. Dr. Perakslis is the Chief Science Officer at Datavant, a technology company dedicated to organizing and integrating the world's healthcare data. He's also a visiting scientist at the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School. He has over 20 years' experience in information technology, informatics, research, healthcare, government regulation, as well as biotechnology and pharmaceuticals discovery and development. He was previously Senior Vice President Data Sciences at Takeda R&D and served as the Chief Information Officer and Chief Scientist Informatics at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Perakslis has kindly offered to share his expertise with us today to better familiarize us with different approaches to biomedical informatics and innovations in big data platforms for biomedical research. We look forward to his insights and advice. Welcome, Eric, and over to you.
Great, thank you. So hey everybody, I'm Eric, thanks for joining. I'm gonna, just as the agenda said, walk through some slides. I'm gonna go through these very quickly. I use slides more or less like cue cards, and they're full of pictures and they're full of links. And I know that y'all will be have access to the slides, which is great because then you can, explore the parts that are interesting to you. One of the, and this is a picture you've probably seen in different forms before, but one of the things we can now do very well in medicine is study pieces of things, an X-ray, a genome, a microbiome. And often people that study this data have trouble putting it back together again. How do you get a picture of all the different determinants of health of a patient, of a subject? And so these are just some of the many domains that we deal with in informatics, and there's many more than this. They're changing all the time. But each of these things is a unique study in and of itself, and then you have to integrate it back to how the person is feeling. The easiest way to think about this is what Google did, right? What Google did is they more or less took a map and they started dropping things on it. They dropped postal codes and buildings and pizza parlors and schools. And the next thing you know, you've got a fairly good dimensional space, and then they still send cars around and take pictures of it all. So I think this is a great paper from quite a while ago on taxonomy of disease that you can use as a reference to show how we put a lot of these different types of data together. The harder thing is hypothesis testing. So a lot of the systems I'm going to talk about, right, are really about very high level scientific hypothesis testing or hypothesis validation. One way to look at these questions is, what drug should I try next with a patient and why? Then you say, well, what has the patient already had? How do other patients do? Are the patients taking any other medications that could get in the way, et cetera, et cetera? So you really start with very big questions and you end up having to make a very small decision. In biomedical informatics, now with the human genome sequenced and sequencing dropping to below $1,000 a genome, we have huge numbers of patients, huge numbers of genomes. The wearable watch can take your heart rate 15 times a second. And if you record someone's heart rate 15 times a second, 24 hours a day for years, I would argue that you're actually measuring something different than heart rate. I would argue that that measure is actually changing. Here's a little bit about this. This has a recent paper by my group and some of the what we call human molecular profiling and human phenotyping that we're doing, where a lot of the clinical trials we've been running, we're using both wearables and we're doing genomics, et cetera. And these papers, Again, you click on the slide, it should take you to the link for the paper. So getting into data and data sharing now, assume you can do these things. Assume that you have all this different data. How do you pull it all together, right? How do you actually come up with one view? How does a human, where we walk around in 3 dimensions of space, right? We do it every day. Some people can figure out 4 or 5 dimensions, but if you're talking about 20 or 30 dimensions, people can't do it. And then how do you bring it back to this, which is how do you get new drugs through the FDA? All the different phases of drug development, they're all experiments, different levels of precision, different levels of security, et cetera, that goes on. So back in more than a decade ago now, I was asked to lead a new group at Johnson & Johnson and really thinking about biomedical informatics in an integrated way. And, put differently, we have all this different types of data. If we could actually put it together, what would we know, right? That's the big question. And these are some of the questions that come out. We understand things like cancer. Every day, cancer becomes more diseases because we're redefining it. We're redefining tumors. We're redefining the genomics of it. Breast cancer used to be a disease. Now it's dozens of diseases, if you think about it that way. So we're constantly redefining the diseases. And then the drug targets, epidemiology, et cetera, also changes very quickly. We went through this already kind of briefly, but classically cancer was by organ system. I actually think at some point this is going to change. Right now, we still call lung cancer, but we know that both genomically and even histologically, that some cancers of the mouth are more like cancers of the lung based on the types of cells that they that have gone wrong, that have mutated and are causing tumors, more so than the organ where it happened. So I think we're going to find diseases being redefined all the time. And then, what this has done is we talk about patient stratification, and said simply, what we mean by patient stratification is I want to know what patients my drug will help, even if it's only 5 patients. If there's 100 people that are sick in the room and my drug helps 5 of them, I want to know why my drug helps 5 of them. And so really getting into it. And what we're finding is, of course, that the fact that there are many different subtypes of disease are part of the problem and part of the solution as well. Drug target identification, we have a lot of drugs out there that are extremely non-specific, right? So if the one to think about would be painkillers. Painkillers don't necessarily have anything to do, especially opioids, with your twisted ankle. They have a lot to do with how your whole body perceives pain, right? And I think if you think of medicine, and if you think about genetics and genomics and all of this fancy stuff we can do, subsetting diseases into smaller and smaller, more specific populations, you'd understand that we're doing the same thing with drug targets. So if 50 people with breast cancer are in a room and there's 16 different types of breast cancer in that room, it means it's very likely that you've got varying numbers of patients that have each type of breast cancer. You may have 30 patients that have one type and all the other people only have one type. So there really is a lot to how we're double clicking down on disease. And we've really been struggling with this for a long time. This is a picture I came up with about 10 years ago. And if you go around, if you follow my arrow and you go around, this is more or less a slightly corrupted version of how drugs are found. We find a target that we're going to drug. We test compounds until we have a lead compound. We try to find a biomarker to show the drug will work. We optimize the lead chemically, biologically. We put it into preclinical testing. We put it into full development in humans. We go around this thing. And out here, all the different data, just a few of the data that are really causing and impacting all these different phases and how quickly they're changing. So the answer is, hey, Eric, can you make this stuff make sense? How do you make this stuff all make sense? So the other thing that was going on at the same time, and this paper's a little bit later, is, as you've probably heard, there's been a great number of consortia worldwide, paper challenges like last year, the New England Journal Sprint Challenge, where a lot of people are starting to think that we have to really start to try to share patient data. And again, let's assume it's anonymized. Let's assume it's phenotypes and labs, and there's no personally identifiable information in there. It's just data about a subject, right, for a second. And what it is, the reason why I tell people I think this is necessary is, to me, I think biomedical data still looks a lot like our solar system. I think where we know a lot of stuff, like take cholesterol drugs. Cholesterol drugs in our solar system would look like a big planet with a bunch of rings and a bunch of little moons around it, right? But then if you went over to pulmonary diseases, you actually have to cross the distance to a whole nother planet. And if you think, we all know in space, that's a pretty far distance, right? So a lot of people think you can just paint the distance between diseases with data. And we're finding it's very difficult to do that. The data is too specific. So without a wormhole or a Stargate, it's pretty hard to go from Mars to Jupiter in a step. And that's one of the reasons why patient data sharing and data sharing became so important about a decade ago, is it's really just building data density. It's like if each of us only has 20 patients, none of us are ever going to cure this disease. If together we have 4,000 patients, maybe we'll have better luck. Also, transparency, right? I think the other reason that data sharing is important is that, well, it's quality in a lot of ways, right? If you know your data is going to be shared and you know your data is going to be reviewed, it's going to be submitted to a journal, you're not going to cut corners, right? You're going to try to make sure that it's quality work that holds up. So I think that's another good aspect. So going back to systems for a second now, when I first started looking at how do you bring all this stuff together, I said, well, we probably need something like a multidimensional clinical data warehouse. And really, we wanted to link all the clinical, biologic, and omics data in one place. We wanted to be able to ask questions of it, but we also wanted to be able to mine it hypothesis-free, which means let early versions of machine learning and things like that ask questions for us. Right? So if the data's smart, it should be able to suggest some questions to you. So long story short, we built this system called Transmart. And here's one of the first papers we did on it back in 2010. And what it was it's a clinical data warehouse that actually links genomes, phenotypes, genetics, radiology reports, anything about a patient in a very translational way. What I mean by translational is the ability to look across those different domains of data, like see the clinical information and the genomics in one context. Now, when we built this system, I was in Johnson & Johnson, and I really decided that the industry needed to do some things a little bit different. So this is a view of Transmart, and what you can see is the first concept on the left is really just brutally simple. How many of you work in institutions where you have a My Documents folder of everybody's research? I know you're all on mute, but I'm assuming you'd still say 0 if you weren't on mute. That's really all this is. We took all of Johnson & Johnson's clinical trials and did a My Documents folder so that you could see the protocol, the sites, the selection criteria, and double click into it. And then you're able to drag and drop data into all types of analysis on the right-hand side. So we built this system and we thought it was pretty good. And I was asked to talk about it, so we wrote some papers, we did some talks, and we started getting a lot of interest. We started getting a lot of people saying, well, that's a pretty cool system, can you tell us more about it? Well, when I was asked to build this huge system, and I said everybody wanted me to put data together, my hypothesis was that answers weren't just going to rain down out of the sky, kind of like pennies from heaven, that you'd still have good science to do. So in building the system, I actually ran 3 social experiments. First one is I based the system upon NIH-funded open source software, I2B2. The second one is I built it to only work in the cloud. So taking you back for a second, 2007, we started putting Johnson & Johnson's clinical trials on the cloud. In 2012, I started putting FDA's clinical trials on the cloud. So I talked to a lot of institutions today in 2018 that say they're still debating whether or not they're going to the cloud. And it's not an answer for everything, but I'm here to say I've got a decade's worth of experience saying it's worked for what we've done. The other reason I built the software open source is so that I could give it away, so that I could share it. And this was a really heretical thing to think about in 2007 in biopharma. You know, a big company like J&J doing an expensive project like this, it must be a competitive advantage. And I argued that it wasn't. So we did this, we open sourced it, we gave it away. And one of the first things shortly after that, I was in the UK helping kick off one of the first innovative medicines initiatives projects, IMI, which you may have heard of, these large public-private biomedical projects that happen in the EU. And I was in a design session for the very first IMI project, and we decided to do this study. And it was interesting because at the time, it really hadn't happened that all these different pharmaceutical companies were going to decide to take all of their patient data and put it into one sharing platform for the sense of running the study. But they did it. You know, we did it. It was actually great fun. Different companies came in, and we hosted it, and they brought their cohorts of data. So you know, kind of where we've been. This is the past. It was officially open sourced I mean, we shared it before it was open sourced, but it was officially open sourced in 2012. Today, there is actually foundations that run Transmart. And so early on, these are some of the IMI and other consortia. As you can see, more than 60 million euros worth of clinical data partnerships were being hosted on this data sharing platform that we just basically built and gave away. So it's amazing how viral it went and how fast it went viral. These are a lot of the nonprofit and government agencies that also use Transmart in different ways. This is actually, I think this is a more update list that the foundation keeps of all the different organizations that now use the system. That in some ways I built, but I kind of open sourced it a bit as a joke, just to see what would happen if I did it. It was kind of, if you built a data sharing platform, would people use it? And I think the data says, yeah, the people really used it, with hundreds of organizations around the world. I go to meetings and I'll be sitting at clinical meetings listening to talks, and people will be talking about this platform and they don't know I had anything to do with it. Here's a little bit of how it works today with I2B2, just so you know that, more the Transmart is a little bit more the clinical study side of things, and the I2B2 is a little more the health record side of things. I pulled this down the other day just because I wanted an update. This is the number of publications across the Transmart Foundation being done off this platform today. This is interesting. So one of the folks that worked on this with me, Paul Avilak, now runs part of the Transmart Consortium. This is back when he was a postdoc. But he wrote this great paper on all of the publicly available data solutions. So I thought this could be very helpful for people on this call if you're thinking about finding a way to share data, either for a small data club or for a consortium or something like that. This is a great paper if you haven't read it. And then, the unexpected happens, right? Like at first, I was sitting in Johnson & Johnson arguing how I have to do this thing, but I had very visionary bosses that said, what my boss said to me was, look, this is all going to be required for us to share all this data someday anyway, so why not just do it now? And then, of course, it ends up being, one of these things that ends up being really, really good publicity. A few more papers in here just to show that this continues. So I started in 2007. Now we're 2014. We're seeing Institute of Medicine, Institute of Medicine and other people really pushing for data sharing. At the same time, one of the fascinating things that's happened is nobody really believed how bad the healthcare cyber threat was going to be. Although me being at FDA, I had an idea. So, healthcare is the most valuable data for people to steal, dollars per record. At least it was last time I wrote a paper on it. And it's obviously a big concern. I do blog for BMJ and some other things. And so there's some papers that you can pull up on that. But I thought this way back from 2012 talked about how medical data was pretty soft targets. And I think we saw this with some of the ransomware attacks and stuff like that. So it's interesting, right? You want to share data, you want to do open technology and open data. And all of these threats are a reason not to do it, right? Wrong. So one of the, here's some of my publications. I had the first New England Journal article on it. We did a really great primer in Science Transmed a couple years ago, and now I'm section editor for an ongoing call for papers in the Journal of Medical Internet Research on cybersecurity. So one of the things that my lab did and what I did is when I decided to do these things 12, 15 years ago, you really have to think about what you've got to be good at, right? And if privacy is important, then get really good privacy people on your team or become one. So there's always reasons not to do something. But there's also reasons to get additional expertise. And I think medical science is too important and data sharing is too important to let cybersecurity and those things make it undoable. I'm running over time here a little bit, but second, really important data sharing is I also helped design the Undiagnosed Diseases Network, which is the coordinating center for National Institutes of Health. What I want to say about this is this happened years after Transmart. And what we decided to do was, go to this side. We actually decided to run this network fully identified. So one of the things that you hear in research networks is everything has to be de-identified. Well, these patients are so rare and their phenotypes are so severe, and we genotype them and their living pedigree that we're actually aggregating so much data on some of these patients, we don't believe we can actually de-identify it properly. So what we did was we built the Undiagnosed Disease Network basically to the US military grades of cybersecurity, for the research network. And it's working fine. It's been up for years. It works really great. But here's the interesting thing. As important as privacy and security is, if you have a really sick child, you might decide that you're willing to tweet pictures of that child in order to find a second child that might have information that would hype the first child. And so the fascinating thing that we've seen in rare diseases is that these patients completely share their data. They put their pictures up, they put their records up because they're looking for help. And we've seen amazing stories of two parents getting together on Facebook and building a whole registry of patients. So data, like everything in medicine, is benefit risk. Everything you're going to do is benefit risk. And I think you've got to think about data and data sharing also as benefit risk. These are just some papers on where I think this is going. The interesting thing is that things are just more and more online. So I'm going to kind of cut through these in the interest of time to these last slides, which are just for you to read how patients are changing. These are really just a list of references that I think are interesting about what's going on in data today. And the last two slides are just a little bit about DataVant. And try to get us back on time here. That's all my slides.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. That was absolutely fascinating. And this is the time when we open up the floor for the webinar attendees. So please take advantage of the opportunity to type in your questions or raise your virtual hand, and we'll take your questions over the phone. I certainly have a lot of questions, Eric. This is fascinating. You have made obviously a major contribution to this whole issue of data transparency, data availability, and data sharing that really does constitute, I think, a disruptive technology. So many questions, but I think I'll start with something that struck me as fascinating. You said data is not a competitive advantage, but it clearly is an asset that J&J had at that time.
Sure.
How did you convince the visionary leaders to let go of the control of that data about your patients? And what was the value proposition for those foundations that decided to take over Transmart?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think what I might have said is that data and technology didn't have the competitive advantage. So what I meant explicitly there, I guess implicitly there, was that J&J wasn't going to sell this clinical data warehouse like we were a software company.
Right.
Right. And we were in consortia where we wanted to share data. So this lowered the activation energy. There were people that when we built this thing said, oh man, that's better than anything Oracle has. You should sell this thing. And it wasn't why I did it. And so what I really convinced them was several things. One is that in the consortia we were in, it made sense to share data, of course. It's funny, pharmaceutical companies spend millions and millions of dollars a year on consortia to solve a problem. If you don't use your data to solve the problem, you're probably missing out. When I was doing the cybersecurity for US FDA, and we were starting to work on open FDA and healthdata.gov, I had 70,000 square feet of paper in the basement of FDA. And it was like, what are we gonna do with this information? And I said, well, if you want me to protect it, why would I do that if it's not useful? Right? Just spin it to disk and stick it in Iron Mountain. So, I think make data useful first, and then you find a way to make all the other things work. But it's really funny. People, they want to, it's too important. I'm going to lock it down. Well, then just take it down. Why are you even spinning it? Just archive the disks off and send it to a vault someplace, right?
Right.
If you're not going to use it.
It's very transformational in terms of how we conceptualize what the value of our research efforts are, really, and what kind of results we're generating and for whom it's of value, and may not be us, in fact. So it's very fascinating. Marshall, do we have any additional questions?
Yes, I've received a few in written form, so I'll read them out one at a time in the order received. So the first of these questions comes from Chris Carlston, who wrote, "Hi, Eric. The orientation of the talk seemed to be treatment rather than prevention. Prevention is typically much more cost-effective. What do you envision in terms of leveraging this approach for prevention?"
It's a great question. I think that the ability to study multidimensional disease, genotypes, phenotypes, obviously would help behaviors and things like that, ways that you can do things. So there are a lot of people and a lot of the nonprofits that use these types of technologies use it for primary prevention. They also use it to try to slow progression, right? So depending upon the type of diseases you're talking about, but it's actually the basic questions about the natural history of disease and whatnot aren't different, as you know, and it's just asking a slightly different question with the same technologies in a lot of ways. So there are a lot of people that use prevention type use cases. That hasn't been what I've done a lot of the time, so it's easier for me to borrow my own slides, but a lot of people do use it that way.
Marshall, any further questions?
Indeed, I have a number. So the next comes from Eduardo Reyes Serratos, who wrote, "Amazing work, Dr. Perakslis. Congratulations. Are governments around the world interested in implementing your work? If so, how do you tackle the different legislation in different countries?"
So that's a great question. The answer would be I don't, they do. One of the things about the open, so there actually are a lot. One of the slides I didn't show was a bunch of hospitals in France, for example, that have used Transmart as a way to link across their patients in different hospitals. Paul Avilac, the gentleman who had that paper, is a French clinician who moved to Harvard. Mostly it happens, these things happen locally with the local regulatory authorities and stuff like that. So it would be the people in the country that are interested to do it. We can apply mentorship. We can, the foundations apply mentorship, technical expertise, a lot of these types of things. But it always, to me, works better kind of bottom up than top down, right? If there are clinicians that want to use it and they want to bring things forward, then it's often a good way for people to do it. But there's usually lots of people that, including myself, that get involved and help a set of clinics, anywhere on the planet that's interested in doing some of those things. The same thing with things like native language support and all of those types of things. It all matters on what makes sense and what's feasible for a given application.
Great, thank you, Eric. And Marshall, any further questions?
Indeed, quite a few. The next one comes from PJ Subarao, who asks, "Can you comment on uptake from ethics boards on allowing sharing and dealing with privacy boards?"
Yeah, I think it's changing very quickly. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that there are institutions and IRBs that are driving around in the Flintstone mobile. I'm not going to say it differently than that. I'm obviously a disruptor. That said, we brought the Undiagnosed Diseases Network. When we decided to go to a federal level of cybersecurity so that the patients would be moved around that internal research network fully identified, Harvard did it, and a national IRB did it, because we were able to articulate the benefits of doing it that way. And so I think, my take is that whether it's an ethics board or privacy board or any of these things, you're always going to have the extreme. But I give most people all the credit in the world for being, reasonable and saying that, look, if you make the right case for the right time, usually you don't have a problem with it. So we've never been stopped, but I think we've also tried to do a really good job engaging with patients, engaging with clinicians, engaging with ethicists. And making sure that when we make an IRB proposal or institutional or to a privacy board, that it holds water before we push send.
Very good, thank you. The next question comes from Lubna Akabir, who wrote, how can junior members of the lab help in the process of data sharing? Any special instructions to handle in-house data to facilitate future sharing, since data sharing endeavors happen in a larger scale multi-PI space?
So that's an outstanding question. Thank you. You know, I think the more organized everybody makes their data, the easier it is to share. Like I'll sit through meetings of some big international medical standards, ICD, whatever, CDISC, whatever. And I hear all these people talking about, well, we need to do this in order to share data. And of course, I'm sitting there saying, we've been doing it for 10 years and we didn't have any of that. So my basic approach is that people that want to share data can and will. But then to answer this question, make it as easy as possible. You know, how are you and your fellow junior faculty or students in the lab organizing your data? You know, do you have a shared drive that makes sense? Can people find the files? You know, I've worked with organizations that use even file naming conventions. You know, it's every file, it's the first 3 letters of their initial, a project number, and then some other thing, to, you know, file type or something. And in an organization of 200 people, everybody knows what each other's file names mean. So there's amazingly simple things, innovative things that you can do that would make data easy to share. And that just again, does that mean the senior people in an institution will decide to do it? Not necessarily, but if you can tell them it's easier and cheaper and less risky than they think it might be, you might help nudge them along.
Great, thank you. The next question is again from PJ Subarao, who asks, have you dealt with pediatric studies and consent issues? Yeah. So I mean, the UDN, the Undiagnosed Diseases Network, it's about 80% pediatrics, and it's across at least 6 clinical centers: Harvard, Duke, Vanderbilt, UCLA, Stanford, several sequencing centers, a whole bunch of functional labs, and patients apply online through a web page. And so all of that all of that was pediatrics. You know, again, I'm a big believer in global IRBs when people are willing to do that, because, you know, if one IRB only allows a 2 millimeter skin punch for kids and the other one says it's a 3 millimeter skin punch, I try not to get involved in that argument, you know, when you're writing these protocols. But I think having a good steering committee, every consortia has to be well governed. There's always a steering committee. Usually smart people sit down, pre-negotiate a lot of this stuff, and move it forward in a way that makes sense, right? So everybody's got to kind of be engaged. But yes, the answer is we do it all the time. Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Chris Ryder, who wrote, do you have any recommendations for software that an individual lab can use to manage omics and clinical data? Ideally, so this can be easily analyzed in R or similar software.
You know, for a single lab, we use a lot of the open, you know, you probably are using what a lot of people at Harvard and other places use. I mean, I've been doing this more in larger institutions, but I know they use a lot of the Broad tools from the Broad Institute and lots of places like that. So you know, I'm not an expert. I think that paper that I referred to earlier actually lists a lot of the different available platforms that are capable of doing lab data and omics data. I think that Paul Avalok paper does exactly that. So that would be a good one to reference, even though it's a few years old. But I'm not personally aware right now. I'm just a little bit out of date on it.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Tim Tuccaro, who is going to address you directly as soon as I unmute him. So Dr. Tuccaro, you're now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Eric. That was really tour de force. Appreciate all that you've done. I'm asking about the promise that many journals have now for reproducibility. They want your data to be deposited, and it's not exactly going very fast. And what is being deposited is really not meeting, in most cases, the bar of reproducibility, at least in my area. It may be better in genetics. I think it is. So I'm in exposure science. And I'm just curious about your take on sort of where we are in the evolution of this process of open data for reproducibility. And I just would note that the Environmental Protection Agency under Scott Pruitt is using open data as a tool to keep evidence out of the regulatory process. So I wondered if you might comment on that constellation as well.
Yeah, okay, so two great questions. So the first one, well, you know what, they kind of put the cart before the horse, didn't they? Because the journals have asked somebody to do something, they haven't really told them how to do it, they didn't give them any specifics on what good looked like, and they actually didn't give anybody a way to do it. So at the time when I was full-time at Harvard Medical School, I was also the executive director of Harvard's Countway Library. And so this is only going back about 4 years. And a lot of people would come to me about this, and I really didn't know what to say to them. I know that there's a new nonprofit named Bivli that's trying to take this on and be the place where academics can put their data. But you know, it's one of these ones where I think the publishing industry is under extreme duress and extreme challenge. And I think that especially because I think it's interesting that the peer-reviewed press in social media are really battling now. I mean, it's funny, I saw something in the Financial Times on cybersecurity, and it actually was a lot of my 2014 New England Journal article. So of course they didn't reference it. When I went to pull it up, it was behind a paywall. And so no wonder they didn't reference it, right? So I think publishing in and of itself is an issue. I guess the advice I would give is to the person that asked the earlier question, at a lab level, I would have a good document store. It can be a drive. It can be on a hard drive for all I care, where everybody's data, raw data is, processed data. And when someone's doing a study and submitting it, they should think about what level of, because that's one of the big questions with this, right? I don't want to give my raw data because they won't understand it. If I give them the process data, they say they can't reproduce it. It's a bit of a thing, but I just think organizing ourselves is the first step to this. And I think it's just going to have to evolve. But right now, I think it's a bit of a mess. Now, I had a paper last February in Nature Drug Discovery, and I said I don't believe there's anything as dirty data. I like to call it wild type data, because, you know, clinicians, of course, are trained that you have to listen to patients, but sometimes patients hide the truth, or they're scared, or they're hurt, or they're forgetful. So I like the idea that open data should be wild type data, but that's not propaganda, and that's not just false data. So I think the whole fake news thing is just a corruption that we all have to fight, no matter what our field is. And I would argue that open data can be just as virtuous as any other type of data. But like I said, this social media versus peer-reviewed journal thing, it's pretty interesting. I mean, even Harvard now, even, you know, universities are starting to look, of course, at media presence in addition to just papers. I think it's all changing very fast, and I don't think we know where it's going to end up. But I sure hope that we find a way to maintain rigor and bring science back to the federal government, for the love of God. As a federal government alumni, that is my wish. Hopefully I didn't make anyone mad with that answer, but it is what it is.
No, I think we all are nodding with you on that one.
Thank you very much, Eric.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Marshall, any further questions?
Yeah, I have one more at present, and this is a follow-up question from Chris Carlston, who asked the opening question about prevention.
Yep.
And I'll read it to you now. He wrote, "Thank you for your thoughtful answer. As follow-up, please. Number one, there was much more money investment in treatment. How do we incentivize more development of the preventive side? And two, do you have a good example of where these approaches have been used successfully for prevention? For example, multi-layered data applied in the novel ways you describe that has led to new insight in terms of effective prevention?" And then a final comment. "I'm a believer, but would benefit from your insight as I try to convince those who are, understandably, skeptical."
Yeah. So these are okay. Understood, and I appreciate the follow-up questions. Right. Public health and prevention in general are difficult, right? Because how do you get people to pay for it, right? So most of my career at the regulatory agency and in private industry stuff has focused on treatment. Now, that said, I think that, the way that the examples I would give would probably be more vaccines based, which you could argue is a different type of prevention. But I think in the HPV space and spaces like that, from a public health perspective, we've been able to show the prevention of certain cancers and the public benefit as well as the financial benefit of some of those vaccines. Not that you can't go online and listen to the anti-vaxxers speaking even more loudly, right? So I do think that's the examples I would give, because those are the ones I'm familiar with, having worked in vaccines. The other places that I've seen it work is I did I had the privilege of doing 2 Ebola relief tours during the worst of that epidemic in West Africa. And I was doing what I always do. I was helping set up technologies for prevention and for how to run clinical trials in the hot zone in the worst of it. And, going into primary settings and using education and using data and using technologies, especially apps, our ability to interact with different cultures based on showing native language videos, based on video games that interest the teenagers and things like that. I think the technologies are being well proven. I think depending upon the specific type of prevention you're talking about, be it a disease, however it's going, I think the tactics might be a little bit different. But I would be happy to liaise with you offline about that. If you had, like a really specific use case or disease area you're interested in, I would be more than happy to brainstorm a little bit about what might be helpful for that. Because this is actually an area of intense interest for me, because it goes a little bit with the fake news thing. We're at a time where we're going backwards, where we've got measles, diseases we never thought we would see, and stuff like that. And people are challenging vaccines, and vaccines aren't even the best model of prevention as we know, right? Just depending on what you're talking about. So I hope I answered more of it this time, but those are the things that came to mind. But yes, I've typically been somebody who's been on the diagnostic or therapeutic or regulatory side of approving a diagnostic or a therapeutic. So that's just the bias in my own background.
Excellent, thank you, Eric. So Marshall, any further questions from the webinar attendees?
No outstanding questions. A couple of folks wrote to thank you for your answers, though.
All right, terrific. And so we have roughly 7 minutes left, and so about 5 minutes for questions, Eric. And I'm going to pop in with a sort of final set of questions for you.
Okay.
With your experience in working in this field, in being an innovator in this field, pushing the boundaries and being sort of ahead of the curve in some ways, what were your lessons learned that really stand out for you? And those could be lessons learned about things that worked well, things that you've learned in the School of Hard Knocks. And the final piece is, of all of the accomplishments that you've had to date, which one or ones are you most proud of looking back?
Oh, thank you. So the first one, I think the most general learning that I would say is that most of the work I've done, I have felt more as a sociologist than a technologist. I think that the technologies to share data, to show data, to protect privacy, to protect security, are actually reasonably robust. I think the folks today have asked the right questions. You usually bump into sociology questions, risk management questions, and things like that. So I would say the most general thing I would say is technology is easy. Getting people to agree on how to use it is more difficult. So that would be the most basic thing. But people do tend to do it. And again, it's that benefit risk thing. If you can show that this is better to do than not to do, that the value you're going to bring is better than if you don't do it. IRBs and people like that can be convinced. I don't know. I've been very blessed and very lucky in my career. I guess I would say I'm most proud of my wife and daughter at first and foremost. But more than anything else, I'm very grateful for the platform that this has given me, because when you have a little success and you get elevated, like when I had my chance to be at the CIO and the first chief informaticist at FDA, that was a huge privilege to be in the Obama administration. And there's so many people in the government right now that are dealing with things I can't even imagine, but I'm so thankful they're there. So I guess I'm thankful for the privilege of service, and that while it does also, you get something out of it, you always get more by giving. And, sitting back and seeing all those organizations using software that was just a bad idea I had is obviously great,
It is very exciting. And, one of the takeaways that sort of is woven through your technology presentation today is the things that you said about, talking to people, discussing it, preparing people for using these things, and of course, asking people if it's really in their interest to keep that data protected, or if they actually want it out there, because that's the only way they can get, in touch with other people who have similar problems and challenges that they have. So that human piece of it is still a huge part of the challenge, the opportunity, and the success factor that you've enjoyed in terms of seeing your system adopted and expanded. It's really scaled globally.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you for your presentation and for your responses to all of our questions. Eric, this has been a wonderful, very, very informative session.